Hello and welcome to the screencast for Lehman College, Political Philosophy, Spring 2020. And in this screencast, we'll talk about the Communist Manifesto Part 2. It's Part 2 in our video lectures. It's actually Chapter 3 of the Communist Manifesto. Okay, so in Chapter 1 and in Chapter 2, we got definitions from Marx and Engels, what the proletarians are and what the bourgeois are, how they developed from Western European history, where it started out as kings and queens, monarchy with aristocracy, with feudalism, and Marx and Engels say that an inevitable final development of both that kind of social organization, that kind of political organization, that kind of legal organization is always going to turn into capitalism. It's always going to turn into a market-driven world. They think that the classical liberal tradition, if we were to roll history back and let it unfurl again, it would always happen again and again and again, because recall their historical materialism. They think the actual world life empirical conditions of the way people live are going to influence everything else, from the way we pass laws to the way we treat each other to what's available to you as a person. And of course, the way we looked at the liberal tradition, outside of the way Marx and Engels look at it, we saw 4 steps, roughly. This isn't canon or anything like that, but we have seen these changes. People were unhappy with the monarchy and the aristocracy, claiming that they had the right to rule over everybody else. They had the right to seize political power because their right to rule came from God. And a lot of people said, no, wait a second, why should anybody have the power to rule over anybody else? There's no possible way that these specific monarchs can justify this claim that they are somehow inherently better than everybody. So from this sort of unhappiness with the way things were organized, the concept of individual human rights, they wouldn't have said human rights, let's say natural individual rights, started to form. This concept started to form, meaning that, hey, maybe everybody, at least in some sense, is equal. And this definitely informed what people thought of as freedom or thought of as liberty. Because if everybody has these sorts of rights, well, then that means everybody should have the freedom to exercise those rights. And as an outgrowth of that, modern property rights began to be indoctrinated into law, both on national levels and on local levels. Meanwhile, the concept of what the job of a government is in the first place started to shift. So we can imagine that in the origins of monarchy, maybe the world was a bit more of a violent place, people taking land and goods and services whenever they had the physical capability to do so, whoever can seize power with their might. So you might say we band together under a government for this because we're afraid of this force, we're afraid of this violence, or we think our monarch can protect us. And this shifts from aristocracy and feudalism, along with these individual rights, to a concept that, okay, it's still the government's job to protect us, but it's also their job to protect our rights as equal citizens. And then in Dewey, we saw that change yet again when we started to think that, okay, it's not just economic protection of freedoms that we should have. It's also the government's job to develop these social programs that help make their citizens be the best people they can be, like Dewey. And of course, Dewey was a couple decades after the Communist Manifesto, but I organized it in such a way so we could see more of a grand overarching structure to how classical liberalism changed to the modern liberalism that we know today. And I wanted you to know that before we started looking at critics of our modern liberal society, which includes, of course, Marx and Engels. So now we have some people who are more on the liberal side, thinking that it's mostly economic freedom that a government has to think about. And then another strain of liberals who think, no, the government should be educating its citizens, taking care of its citizens' health and welfare, and that it needs to create these programs to make people have better lives. Now, Marx and Engels definitely want to emphasize that all this history we just looked at, from Hobbes even, but mostly we started at Locke, all the way up to now, hasn't led to so-called eternal truths about what freedom is, what government is for, what justice is, the way we should organize society, or the way we should organize our economy. Instead of discovering through reason and empirical content the perfect way to set up a political and social system, it is something that has led to this massive underclass, the proletariat, the working class, that will definitely rise up against their masters. And of course, the masters are the bourgeois or the capitalist class. And they admit that they're not the first people to notice that there are negative consequences to the Industrial Revolution or to capitalism. And that's what this chapter is going to be about. They're going to compare and contrast communism, their politics, to other kinds of socialists, other kinds of people that have noticed the ills of a classically liberal tradition of the Industrial Revolution and capitalism. But of course, they're going to conclude that communism is the only actual way to destroy this massive inequality that has been caused by capitalism and the Industrial Revolution. But first, before we take a specific look at that, I wanted to talk about capitalism and socialism today, because of course in 1850 the world was very different to the way it is now. And both schools of thought have undergone massive development by many different thinkers. So of course, this isn't a history class, this isn't an economics class. We're only going to briefly touch on the biggest concepts and sort of ideas so you can have maybe some idea of what to think about when you're comparing and contrasting the statements of Marx and Engels to what might be relevant or applicable today. So sometimes socialism and capitalism are offered only as economic systems, meaning only focused on how goods and services are produced and distributed, who gets access to them, and why and how. Other people say that both of them, and any system we might try and implement in the world, can't just be only economic. They're going to end up being social as well, a socio-economic system, meaning it's going to order classes, wealth, but additionally, it's also going to say, well, if you're born into some strata of society, these are your possible opportunities. These are the things you have available to you concretely, things like education, things like healthcare, things like generally what your society values. So how we distribute goods ends up affecting who we think we are and or what we think is possible of us. And this is why I have a list of goods here. Because sometimes when we read the Communist Manifesto, we only think of physical factories making physical products. And that was high on their mind. But we can also think of the economies of our social systems, like I said, our education, our healthcare, our housing systems, our technology. How do we distribute it? Who has access to knowledge and why? All these things are social goods, not material goods. And of course, labor itself. Marx and Engels say that in capitalism, labor is commodified. Remembering when something is a commodity, we could exchange it with any other member of its class and lose or gain nothing because everything is identical to everything. So if you go to the store and get the first toothpaste that is on the edge of the shelf, or you dig all the way back to the back of the shelf and pick up that same brand of toothpaste, it's commodified because it's exactly the same. And when it comes to labor, the actual people that are doing the work, we don't want to commodify people. But Marx and Engels make the argument that capitalism necessarily commodifies labor and commodifies people. This concept points towards something we've touched on before with positive and negative rights, wherein negative rights are the rights to be left alone, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, etc. No one's allowed to commit violence upon you, where positive rights are in that Dewey sort of stream, where we create positive systems of healthcare, economics, technology, ideas, art, business that increase the opportunity and possibility in everybody's lives. These kinds of things, of course, are needs-based goods versus something desire-based, like when you would want a luxury label for your clothes or for your cars. So goods is really, really general concept that needs specification when you talk about it, when you're discussing which socioeconomic system might be better, or which aspects of a socioeconomic system might be better for whatever reason. Okay, and of course, Marx and Engels could have never anticipated our contemporary world. They were writing 160, 170 years ago. So what of the capitalism and socialism that are present today? They didn't even live to see anything like the USSR or China. We're going to kind of stay away from that and focus more on the philosophical issues. But we can still think of general categories of capitalism and socialism that exist today. You might have heard the term neoliberalism in your life. And I'm going to contrast that with something we might call just progressivism or liberal today. So if you were to talk to somebody and hear their political point of view, and you might say they're a progressive or a liberal, they're more like Dewey. They're more saying we need some sort of social structure given to us by the government that helps people live their lives. Whereas neoliberals are sort of that utilitarian older version that Dewey was talking about from Mill, where the freedom comes in from market freedom, where capitalists are free from government regulation, laissez-faire, to accumulate capital, to build up their industry, and they have a negative liberty from the government to organize themselves however they want. This is an economic neoliberalism, is an economic definition of capitalism today. Liberals, like I said, can be used sort of in Dewey's second sense, where we want some reform in the way we use our collective resources. Now, this whole list, you can take a look at it if you want. It's from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, which is peer-reviewed, which means just like a journal, it has been vetted as a good academic source. And to sort of condense part of what they're saying. They say that a capitalist society has to meet 1 through 5, or at least it usually meets most of them. It definitely meets number 1, or I. Where in a capitalistic society, the bulk of the means of production is privately owned and controlled. We have covered that before. Okay, and here's one difference between slavery or feudalism. Stanford Encyclopedia says you do own your labor power. Nobody can force you to work at a particular factory or office. So if you wanted to, you can take your body and your labor to a different company. And that is a difference and possibly an improvement on a system of feudalism, where someone else might control your labor power. 3, markets are the main mechanism allocating inputs and outputs of production and determining how society's productive surplus is used, including whether and how it's consumed or invested. So in a perfect market capitalist society, everything, including education, including healthcare, including housing, the markets would determine everything. Supply and demand, exchange, contracts. Remember, we always talked about a contractual sort of society. It would even out. It would come to an equilibrium. But usually 4 and 5 are also involved once you have 1 to 3, they say in the Stanford Encyclopedia. Number 4, there's a class division between capitalists and workers. So we saw that in Marx and Engels. Capitalists are the people that own the means of production. Okay, so that might be that factory when we're just thinking about material goods. But if we're thinking about healthcare, they own the hospitals. They own the networks of ambulances. They own the insurance companies. And they hire a laboring class to do the actual work for them. So there are capitalists who are just accumulating capital, and there are workers who are doing the work of producing the goods and services. And there's always going to be some type of relationship between these capitalists and between these workers. Marx and Engels say it's always a struggle, but Stanford Encyclopedia here is trying to be a little bit more neutral. Can be conflict, can be subordination, can be bargaining. And these two classes negotiating things continuously shapes the labor market and the broader political process. And this one at 5 is a little bit more controversial. Production is primarily oriented to, capital accumulation. So instead of trying to produce goods and services to meet human needs, capitalists and capitalism is oriented toward the profit motive and only the profit motive. And then a paragraph or 2 down, if you ever click through to look at this website, they say what changes under socialism is 1 or I star. Instead of the bulk of the means of production being privately owned and controlled, it's under social democratic control. So that's something that probably all socialists today would agree on. The problem comes in when once you switch I to I star, there are many different kinds of socialism that think 2, 3, 4, and 5 shift in different ways. Most people want you to own your own labor power. Communists wouldn't. Communists would say everything gets distributed equally, including the jobs that you are required as a duty to the state and yourself to do. There are some socialists who think there's a place for markets, but they would have to be tightly regulated in order to meet human needs. So socialists are not necessarily unified. But one of the ideas that is present in all of them, the bulk of the means of production is under social democratic control. So democratic control of, yes, factories, but also healthcare, education, housing, etc. Now, that list we just looked at is economic. What about the social aspects? Remember, and I brought this up because I want you to think always about this historical materialism. That's sort of the foundational concept that Marx and Engels think orders history, human history. The economic conditions are the ones that lead to the social conditions. The economic conditions are fundamental because everybody needs stuff to survive. So you get social status and political power from your productive or economic power. So even if you don't agree with that, even if you think that political power affects economic power and vice versa, maybe you think it's a big circle, you still have to admit that what kinds of goods and services are available to you is going to affect who you become. If you have no access to education versus a nice schooling, nice set of schools from birth all the way up through college, you can see that the opportunities surrounding you when you're born are going to affect your social opportunities. They're going to affect how you think about yourself, what your opportunities are, and how you think about your life. But most modern socialists don't think we'll reach our social goals, so apart from our economic ones, our goods and services, unless we focus specifically on social goods instead of something like capital accumulation and the profit motive. We need to socialize our economy and our world if we want justice, equality, or fairness. And again, we can think back to Dewey. Remember that he had the surprising idea that you're not a fully realized individual if you're just given negative rights, if you are just left alone by the government. The social world that you're born into narrows your opportunities so much that you never have the chance to reach your potential. So in one sense, he agreed with Marx and Engels, but he thought it could be done without such a radical elimination of property rights, and he thought it could be done without violence. So finally, we get to the actual content of chapter 3. And a lot of this chapter, I want to say, isn't as relevant to us as the philosophical content in chapters 1 and 2, because this is a history of a time and a place. But there are some philosophical points in here that we will briefly touch upon. I have first what is socialism here, no easy, because originally I had this before all of the previous slides we've looked at, so you can just ignore that and look at 1, 2, and 3. This is how the chapter is organized. He first talks about what he calls, I say he, I mean Marx and Engels, they talk about reactionary socialism, 2, conservative or bourgeois socialism, and 3, critical utopian socialism and communism. So these are the 3 schools of people or groups of people that he thought also noticed the negative sides of classical liberalism and capitalism. But he's going to say, okay, let's look at 1, 2, and 3, and we're going to come to the conclusion that communism is better than all of them at meeting human needs. Reactionary socialism comes about when people who are from the old style of politics, the old style of economies, say, hey, wait, I'm losing all my power. And so the aristocrats, the prince and princes and the managers of land and the monarchy. Well, how do they stop losing their power? They react. They react against the capitalists, against the bourgeois, and they ended up in many historical scenarios siding with the workers against the bourgeoisie. And the way they did so is to say, look how much better it was back then. You weren't exploited. You, as a serf, could work the land, or you could be an artisan, but now you're just a cog in a machine. But of course, Marx and Engels say, number one, you can't go back, because capitalism is an inevitable result of the way they did things. But also, the people were still exploited under feudalism and under monarchy, just in a different way. So there's no going back, and we should look forward to something where no one is exploited instead of reacting and trying to go back to the way things were. So the petty bourgeoisie are people who are kind of middlemen. They don't own or accumulate a lot of capital, but they sort of hang on the coattails of the capitalist class. And if you want to think about people like that today, it might be some sort of skilled laborer who sells their intellectual value or creativity to the people who are actually accumulating wealth. But in any case, this kind of petty bourgeois is either their job is being made obsolete by capitalism and by automation, and thus they'll be thrown into the proletariat themselves, or the petty bourgeoisie is always going to side with the regular bourgeoisie because that's who they want to be. They want to be wealthy. They want to be capitalists. They want their comfortable life. But Marx and Engels say both of them will lose to the capitalist class for that same reason. We can't go back. It's just not the way things work. Material circumstances of the world have changed. So the only way we can change them is to change our material circumstances. And why would we ever change it back to feudalism? Then he takes a little detour into German or true socialism, which is important for us only because it reinforces or highlights another aspect of historical materialism. Marx and Engels said that Germany lagged behind France and England as well, but we're mostly focusing on French socialist theory. So the French Revolution had just happened, the monarchy was overthrown, and German intellectuals took some French ideas and tried to adapt it to Germany. But Germany was still a largely feudal society at this time. So again, highlighting historical materialism, ideas can only help a society that has the right material conditions. And since there was no working class versus the bourgeoisie yet, the socialist ideas just flopped. They became another tool for the aristocrats to fight against the capitalist class. There was no class consciousness yet. There was no widespread negative consequences of industrialization. So the material conditions of Germany just weren't ready for communist or socialist ideas yet. The third kind, or no, this is the second kind, excuse me. Wait a second. Yes, the second kind of socialism that Marx and Engels discuss in chapter 3. Here's a quote. The socialistic bourgeois want all the advantages of modern social conditions without the struggles and dangers necessarily resulting therefrom. They desire the existing state of society minus its revolutionary and disintegrating elements. So these are people who want charity to take care of the working class. They want some reforms like a shorter work day or maybe a no child labor. They want to reap all the benefits of being in political, social, and economic power, but they want to stave off people getting angry, the class consciousness of the working class, so there'll be no revolution. And they will actually go further and make the argument that some elite, like the bourgeois, taking care of everybody is the most preferable way to organize society. So they'll say, yes, everybody is a worthwhile human being, but we need an elite class to decide how the goods of life should be distributed. And it should be us, the bourgeois, the capitalist class. So right before communism came together as a political movement, and right before I mean a couple generations, maybe one generation even, were the critical utopian socialists, or at least that's what Marx and Engels called them. They're the intellectual precursors to communism. Again, this is right when the capitalists were starting to expand their control over material goods and services and their distribution. So again, the world wasn't ready for communism. But these intellectuals still saw the dangers inherent in classical liberalism and capitalism. And in a key development, they recognized class antagonism, that the capital owning class and the workers would always be at odds with one another. But like I've mentioned several times, it was too early in history for this. So instead of proposing revolution to get to a no-class society, they said, let's develop social science. Let's develop laws to figure out how to fix the problems in capitalism and liberal politics. Okay, we don't have to worry about chapter 4 at all, and I did mention that we would talk about some of the supplemental materials, but I think you can peruse those if you'd like. They're not necessarily central to our goals. Chapter 4 talks about some historical contexts of what the communists are doing at that point in Western Europe. So if you're interested in that, you can take a look at it. But for us, we're more concerned with the development of our historical tradition, our classical liberalism, and how we might start to critique it. So some questions I want you to think about when you're doing your homework, when you're doing your journal entries, or even if you're just interested in the ideas, maybe. I want you to think about Marx and Engels' criticisms of capitalism. Are they still valid today? We know that capitalism and socialism, but capitalism is still our dominant form of social and economic life. So how might they have to be changed to apply to the world today? What about their criticism that there's no such thing as an eternal truth when it comes to the organization of society or politics or economics? Do you think maybe with any of your background information, do you think they're always wrong? Do you think that there's anything that we've learned about political organization, about social organization, that could pass as truth? And what do you think? There's one other big question I want you to think about. If the ideal of communism were suddenly all of the entire world, what happens to concepts like freedom, liberty, and justice? Marx and Engels never talk about that because they think they are too thoroughly corrupted by the classical liberal tradition and by capitalism. What do you think a socialist version of freedom, liberty, or justice might mean? Okay, and I just have here that the document you can use for your journal entry is up online, and it's a selection from Stephen Kinzer's book Conquest on the United States' annexation of the state of Hawaii. And like I said, that's up on our Blackboard. Please, as always, let me know if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, and have a great day.